Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library. My name is Tim Grimes. I'm the Manager of Community Relations and Marketing for the library. And thank you so much. This is a wonderful crowd. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice. The title is American Sons, Reflections on Being Muslim in America. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Ron Gregg from the Interfaith Council, who will introduce tonight's program. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I am a member of the Common Ground Working Group of the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice. And we want to also welcome each of you and tell you how much we appreciate your coming tonight. We also are grateful for the Ann Arbor District Library and their hosting of this program. This is a discussion tonight with a very distinguished panel on what it means to be Muslim in North America. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Sherman Jackson, well-known and very honored professor of Near Eastern Studies, Law, and Afro-American Studies at the University of Michigan. Previously, he taught at Texas, Indiana, and Wayne State Universities. Not only does Dr. Jackson teach and do research and lecture, but he also writes lots of books. The most recent being Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering, which was published just last year. That same year, Dr. Jackson was named one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world by the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies Center in Amman, Jordan, and was also recognized as one of the 10 leading experts on Islam in America. It's hard to do any better than that. So please help me welcome Dr. Jackson.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm told that I have about 10 minutes to try and to introduce the whole topic of Islam in America. Anybody who knows me knows that it usually takes me longer than 10 minutes to even say my name. But I'm going to try and to do so in a way that will be coherent. The history of Islam in America is actually a quite long history. At the same time, it is a somewhat uneven history. The presence of Muslims in America goes back to the very beginning, not simply of the Republic, but actually of the settlement of America as part of the New World. We know that among the population of both slaves who were brought from Africa and even some of the indentured servants who came along with the Spanish and others included a population of Muslims. And this goes back to the very early centuries. The numbers of Muslims would increase somewhat after that as the importation of slaves from Africa reached full tide in the 18th century. And so we have the presence of Muslims quite early on in America. And this is not simply mythical. It's a very interesting phenomenon in that we actually have Arabic manuscripts that are survivals from African slaves who were actually in America in the 18th and 19th centuries. And there have actually been scholars who have worked on some of these manuscripts. So their presence is not simply mythological. We have tangible, concrete evidence of their presence. These are, of course, the first Muslims to come to America. Now, what we are seeing today in terms of the presence of African-American Muslims oddly does not go back to the beginning of the presence of African Muslims in America. The African Muslim community on American soil is not able to perpetuate itself. And so, whereas if you get a mother or a father from Africa who happens to be Muslim, 9.5 times out of 10, the children would not survive as Muslims. Of course, they weren't allowed to sustain marriages and families, and they were not allowed really to establish even places of worship. So it was a very difficult task to perpetuate Islam within that slave community. So if 9.5 out of 10 times you would lose the son or daughter, 10 out of 10 times you would lose the grandchildren. And so what we have is a situation whereby Islam in the African community is not able to perpetuate itself on American soil. What we are seeing today in terms of the spread of Islam among African Americans is actually a 20th century phenomenon. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. In the meantime, I want to talk about two separate waves of immigration from the Muslim world. The first wave actually begins in the late 19th century and extends into the early parts of the 20th century. Most of the Muslims who came to America from the Muslim world came from the Fertile Crescent. They were subsidiaries of the Ottoman Empire, and they came to America for the same reason that everybody else came to America, to find a better life. At that time, however, there were not really critical masses of immigrants from the Muslim world. And you get small pockets of immigrant Muslims attempting to reestablish or reconstitute Muslim communities in America, but that's a very difficult process. One of the reasons for that is that, unlike the situation in the late 20th century, in the late 19th and early 20th century, most of the Muslims who came from the Muslim world came from more rural areas. They were farmers and artisans and sort of what you might call blue-collar workers. And therefore, they did not have either sort of the cultural sophistication in every instance or the surplus income to really build and sustain institutions. The real change would come in 1965. In 1965, of course, the American government prorogued what was called the National Origins Act. The National Origins Act was an act of Congress that was basically designed to ensure that the population of the United States remained predominantly Northwest European. In 1965, the Johnson administration rescinded that bill. And this opened the floodgates for immigration from the Muslim world. And this is the beginning of the phenomenon that we are witnessing in large part today in terms of the large numbers of Muslims who immigrate to America. And then we're getting second and third generation immigrant Muslims. Well, they're no longer immigrant Muslims, but second and third generation Muslims from those kinds of backgrounds. Now, those Muslims are, in a very real sense, very different from the first wave of Muslims who immigrated from the Muslim world. And they are different in that they, i.e. the second wave of immigrant Muslims, are highly educated. And therefore, they become a very capable community. They're able to generate surplus income. They have education and sophistication. They have contacts, of course, because they're going to the best universities in which they're intermingling with other Americans, and they are networking with other Americans. And this puts them in a position to build institutions, schools, mosques, Islamic centers, and to perpetuate and sustain themselves. And so what we have is a situation that's very different from what we saw in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, alongside this, I want to bring back up to speed the African-American contingent, because these are two very different trajectories of the historical development of Islam in America. The African-American community, in terms of the establishment of critical masses within the black American community, actually goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. It's a very rich and detailed history, but I'm going to try and condense it in, I guess, the 2 minutes that I have left. going back to the beginning of the first decades of the 20th century, the spread of Islam in the black community actually begins with what we might call the proto-Islamic movements. Now, these were movements among black Americans that had, for one reason or the other, become disaffected from Christianity and began to search for alternative modalities of religiosity in America. Islam was something that they found, but more as an idea, an orientation, and perhaps most importantly, an alternative vocabulary. You have to go back to the 1910s and 1920s to remember or to recall that at that time, black Americans are still in the stage of trying to carve out a sort of identity that would enable them to escape the negative implications of blackness that have been imposed upon them by the dominant culture. Islam provided an avenue to that because Islam was looked upon as being an entity over which the dominant culture exercised no control. And so blacks would be free to engage in this process of self-identity formation as Muslims or as people associated with Islam in ways that they would not quite be able to do so as Christians at that time. All right? Now, it's important to note here, however, then, again, that the Islam that they attached themselves to was more an idea and an ideal than a reality. And this is why I call it the proto-Islamic movements. These were movements that were not founded in doctrines and religious practices that historical Islam would recognize as being orthodox. In fact, they were quite heterodox in orientation. Nevertheless, this phase of the development was extremely important in as much as it had the effect of ingratiating the black community in general with the idea of Islam, which is to say that it's not very long before Islam in the black community comes to be recognized as a legitimate form of an alternative mode of American blackness. All right? In other words, whereas, and this is probably still the case today, culturally, civilizationally, or historically, one might say, one might assume a certain amount of, contradiction, shall we call it, between American whiteness and Islam. The proto-Islamic movements led to a situation where all dichotomies, all contradiction between being black and being Muslim had been removed, even for people who were not Muslims. In other words, Islam became a legitimate expression of blackness within the broader black American community. All right? And what this does is it opens the way for what I like to refer to as communal conversions. That is to say that not the entire community converts, all right, but it produces a situation whereby it becomes quite natural for an African American to be a Muslim in ways that would not quite apply in the same degree to white Americans. And so what we have are two large arteries entering into the basin of American Islam. We have the African American community evolving out of this sort of heterodox history, which itself transforms into orthodoxy, all right, between the 1960s and the 1980s. So by the time we get to the late 1980s, of all of the black Americans who had entered into the heterodox representations of Islam, upwards of 95% of them would now be Orthodox Sunni Muslims. And so what we have are black American Orthodox Sunni Muslims coming from their